The chains were still warm from the last prisoner when they locked them around her wrists. Seren didn't look at the Alpha King. That was the first choice she made when Captain Dravel read the charges aloud in front of the entire court. She chose not to look at the man who had just destroyed her life, because if she looked at him, she would cry. And she would rather bleed than cry in front of these people. The great hall of Vielle Dune smelled of beeswax candles and old power, of perfumed nobles sweating beneath their finery, and beneath all of that, just barely, the cold mineral scent of the dungeon already rising from the stone floor like a memory, like a promise. Serene of the Ashford pack. Captain Dravel had a voice like a horn, all ceremony, no warmth. You stand accused of poisoning the king's war bond treaty with the Northern Territories, of replacing the sealed document with a forgery, of conspiracy against the throne. She heard the court shift, silk against marble, the small, bright sound of someone's wine glass being set down too hard. How do you answer? I didn't do it, she said. Her voice came out steadier than it had any right to. She was aware of every face turned toward her, the hot weight of 300 pairs of eyes, and somewhere high on the dais above them all, the cold weight of one pair more. She still didn't look up. The physical evidence is conclusive. Dravel turned a page on his scroll as if it were a grocery list. Your script, your seal, your ink, confirmed by the palace archivist. Someone used my materials. She kept her eyes level, fixed on the middle distance. Someone who had access to my rooms and enough skill to replicate my hand. I was in the lower archives all that day. The sub-archivist can confirm. Sub-archivist Pell gave his statement. Dravel cut her off, not unkindly. He was just a man doing his job. That was somehow worse. He says you left at midday, 2 hours unaccounted for. She had been walking along the river, alone, because she often walked alone, because that was who she was, and nobody had ever needed to know where she was when she was nobody at all. That was her flaw, and she knew it now like a blade between the ribs. She trusted her own invisibility. She had spent 23 years moving through the palace as a junior archivist, as an Ashford pack girl 3 steps below everyone who mattered, and she had been so certain that nobody saw her that it had never once crossed her mind that someone might be watching, that someone might have chosen her precisely because she was so easy to erase. She heard him then. Not his voice. He hadn't spoken yet. Not once. But the sound of him. The particular silence around him deepening. The way the court held its breath whenever he shifted in his chair. Then, beneath the beeswax and the silk sweat and the stone-cold air, the faintest trace of something reaching her. Pine. Cold water over dark slate. Controlled power like a held fist. The Alpha King. She finally looked up. He was already looking at her. Caius Vielle had a face made for war. Strong jaw. A nose that had been broken once and healed at a slight angle. That single imperfection the only thing that stopped him from being merely beautiful, and made him instead arresting. He wore no crown in the great hall. He'd never needed one. The authority lived in the bones of him, in the set of his wide shoulders, in the absolutely still quality of his hands resting on the arms of his throne. He was watching her the way you watch a fire, like something he expected to go out, and his eyes were doing something she could not name. Not cold, exactly. Not warm. Something under glass. Some pressure behind the gray-green that was contained with a precision that looked almost like pain. She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then she looked away first, because she had done nothing wrong, and still she was standing in chains in front of 300 courtiers, and she was not going to beg. The throne finds the evidence sufficient, Dravel said. By order of His Majesty King Caius Vielle, Siren of the Ashford Pack is remanded to the royal dungeon pending further inquiry. A pause. Then, because she was not going to go without saying it, "Your Majesty," she addressed him directly for the first time. Her voice carried. She made sure of it. "I am innocent. Whatever has convinced you otherwise, I am innocent." The court went so quiet she could hear her own blood. He said nothing. He held her gaze, and his jaw worked, just barely, just once, and he said absolutely nothing. The guards came for her, and she walked out with her chin level, and the last thing she heard as the great doors closed behind her was the sound of his court resuming around him like he was already somewhere else. She was 3 flights of stairs underground by the time the first tear came. She let it fall. 1. She didn't wipe it away. She had earned it. And then she straightened her spine and looked at the walls of the dungeon and began to figure out how she was going to survive this. The royal dungeons were not, she discovered, what the stories suggested. They were old. The stone had a quality of absorbed cold that nothing would ever entirely warm. She would come to know this cold intimately, the way it lived in her joints, the way it smelled of centuries of damp and iron, and the faint, ghostly trace of every person who had been afraid here before her. But they were not filthy. The cells had a sleeping pallet, thin but clean. There was a window slit above hers, high up in the wall, that admitted a finger width of sky. She could hear the river from there, just barely. A low, continuous sound like something breathing. The first night she catalogued her resources the way her archivist training had taught her to approach any unfamiliar collection. Methodically, without panic. 1 blanket, slightly moth-eaten but whole. 1 bowl. 1 straw-stuffed pallet. A grate in the floor for drainage. 3 walls of stone and 1 wall of iron bars, beyond which the dungeon corridor stretched in both directions under the weak yellow light of evenly spaced torches. Her wolf was very quiet. That frightened her more than the chains had. Serene's wolf had always been a present, restless thing. She didn't shift. She was too low-ranking for that to be graceful or useful. But she had always felt her animal self as a particular warmth in her sternum, an alertness that made the edges of the world a little sharper. Now that warmth had pulled inward, like something bracing. The guards changed at midnight. She knew this by the sound, the specific drag of a boot heel on stone that meant the night rotation coming through, the brief murmur of handoff, and then quiet. She had been in her cell for 6 hours when she heard him. She nearly missed it. She had been lying on the pallet staring at the finger width of sky. She could see 2 stars from here if she positioned her head just right. 2 small, cold lights like punctuation at the end of a sentence she hadn't finished reading. And then something changed in the air of the corridor. A shift in pressure. The quality of the silence outside her bars turning different, denser. The way a room changes when someone important walks into it. Pine. Cold water over dark slate. The controlled fist scent of him. Thicker now. And beneath it. Beneath the familiar architecture of it. Something she hadn't caught in the great hall. Something that had been suppressed up there under ceremony and watched eyes in the armor of his authority. Here, in the dark, with 3 hours to midnight and the torches burning low, he hadn't suppressed it. It smelled like tension, like held breath, like a man standing outside a door and not knowing why he'd come. She didn't move. She didn't look toward the bars. She lay perfectly still on the pallet with her face toward the stone wall, and her heart beating at the base of her throat, and she listened to him breathe. He stayed for 20 minutes. He didn't speak. He didn't rattle the bars or make his presence known. He just stood there in the corridor outside her cell, and eventually she heard him exhale. A long, controlled thing, like setting something down. And then his footsteps moved away, back up toward the palace, and the corridor returned to its ordinary dark. She lay still for a long time after, then quietly, to the stone. "What are you doing?" No answer. Naturally. But the question settled something in her chest, and she slept. The night guard's name was Oswin Farrell. He had a habit of touching the back of his neck when he was uncertain, a quick, unconscious press of 3 fingers just below his hairline. And he had the kind of face that had been kind since birth, the sort of face that belonged behind a bakery counter or bending down to talk to a child, and clearly had no business being in a dungeon. He brought her a second blanket on the 3rd day without being asked. He just slid it between the bars and went back to his post without making it into anything. She said thank you. He touched the back of his neck. "You shouldn't be here," he said. And then, alarmed at himself, "I didn't say that." "You didn't say anything," Serene agreed. He had been on night rotation for 4 years. He was the one who reported, she would learn this later, what he called the king's visits in the official log, because he was required to log all persons who entered the dungeon level, and he was constitutionally incapable of lying in an official document. He wrote it every night, in his careful, cramped handwriting. King, present, cell 7 corridor, duration, approximately 20 minutes, no incident. And then, she imagined, he touched the back of his neck and said nothing to anyone. "The sub-archivist," she said to Oswin on the 4th evening, when he brought her supper, a decent bowl of stew, and she had begun to understand that this too was probably not standard. "Pell, he said I left the lower archives at midday. That's not true." "I wouldn't know about that. You know everyone in the palace. You've been here 4 years. Oswin was quiet for a moment. His fingers found the back of his neck. "Pell goes to the upper betting houses on first-day evenings," he said finally. "He has debts." She let that sit. Debts to whom? But Oswin had remembered himself. He picked up her empty bowl from the evening before, and he went back to his post, and he didn't answer. But his silence had a shape to it, the shape of a name he wasn't going to say. The king came again on the 5th night. This time she heard him earlier. She had been waiting, though she had told herself she wasn't. And she sat up on her pallet and watched the corridor through the bars. The torches were at their lowest. The shadows had the thick, specific quality of deep night, the kind of dark that feels personal. He came around the far curve of the corridor and stopped 6 feet from her cell. He wasn't in court clothes. He wore a plain, dark shirt, loose at the collar, and trousers that had seen use, and his feet were in soft boots, the kind you wore when you wanted to move quietly. His hair was slightly disordered. He had one hand in his pocket, and the other hanging loose at his side, and he was looking at her with that same expression she'd seen on the throne, the thing under glass, the pressure, except that here, without the watching court, the glass was a little thinner. She looked back at him. Neither of them spoke. The cold in the dungeon had a sound to it, a kind of resonance in the stone. The river was doing its low breathing far above. She was aware, in the particular heightened way of her wolf pushing forward and retreating, of how still he was. He could hold himself motionless in a way that wasn't stillness at all. It was the stillness of something that could move in an instant. Predator still. "Your Majesty," she said, because one of them had to. Something shifted in him. Not his face. He didn't let it go to his face. But in the quality of his presence, the way the air between them changed. Serene. Her name, and nothing else. She had never heard him say her name before. She catalogued this information carefully, without expression. "Is there something you wanted?" she asked. His jaw worked. "I'm conducting—" He stopped, began again. "There are aspects of your case that require review. At midnight. The palace is busy during the day. You're the king, she said. The palace is as busy as you want it to be. The pressure behind his eyes intensified. He was not used to being spoken to this way. She knew that, and she didn't care. Because she was in chains in his dungeon for something she hadn't done, and she had left politeness somewhere between the great hall and the first flight of stairs. He reached into his pocket, produced a small folded square of paper, and crouched, pushing it through the bar's gap at floor level. She didn't move. It's a summary of the evidence file, he said. The palace archivist's report. Why would you give me that? He was still crouching, eye level with her now. His voice, when it came, was very careful. So you can review it. And if I find something the archivist missed, then you can tell Oswin. A pause, brief and careful. He'll make sure I hear it. She looked at the paper on the floor of her cell, then at him. You're not here about the evidence. He stood up. The glass came back, harder than before. Good night, Saren. He left. She picked up the paper and read it by torchlight until her eyes burned, and she found 3 things that didn't add up. And in the morning she told Oswin, and Oswin touched the back of his neck and wrote something in the log that was not about the king's visit. There was a morning, the 10th day, when she woke to find a smell she didn't expect. Not his scent. She had come to know that as a constant, a background frequency that arrived sometime before midnight and faded by dawn. This was different. Something sweet and resinous, warm in a way the dungeon absolutely was not. She sat up and found, on the stone outside her bars, a small cloth bundle. Oswin, when he appeared at the morning rotation, looked at the back of his neck with both hands briefly and said nothing. Inside the bundle, 2 dried figs, a piece of hard cheese wrapped in wax cloth, and a folded note in handwriting she recognized as the king's. It said only, Sub-Archivist Pell's debt records arrived from the palace accountant. 3 payments. Most recent, 6 weeks ago. I'm following the thread. She ate the figs and the cheese slowly, reading the note twice, and felt, for the first time since the chains, something she could cautiously call hope. She wrote her reply on the back of the note with a piece of charcoal she'd found in the corner of the cell. The payments align with the timeline of the forgery's preparation. Look for a middle payment. That's when they would have needed access to my seal. My seal was logged out through the official archive registry on the 13th of last month. Someone signed for it who wasn't me. The registry is in the lower archive, 3rd shelf from the left, under document control, seals and instruments. She added, after a moment's pause, in smaller writing, the figs were unnecessary. Thank you. She folded it and left it between the bars, and by the next morning it was gone. On the 7th night he came, and she was ready. She had folded herself into the far corner of the cell, not to hide, but to think, and thinking required her to be small and contained. And she had the evidence summary in her lap and a list of questions in her head, and when she heard him in the corridor she stood up and came to the bars herself. He stopped when he saw her already standing. Something moved through his expression too fast to name. The ink, she said. The archivist says the ink used on the forgery is consistent with the archive supply, but you can also buy that ink from Callaway's on the South Market. Who in this palace shops at Callaway's? He was close to the bars now, close enough that she could see the darker ring around his gray-green irises, could catch the full depth of his scent. Pine and slate and something warmer underneath that she kept making the mistake of reaching toward. Some undertone of him that wasn't about power or control. That was about something else entirely, and that her wolf kept trying to identify. Callaway's has records, he said. Then look at them. I've already sent someone. She studied him. You started this before tonight. Yes, Before you came here. Yes. A silence. The river breathing. The low burn of the torches. Why didn't you just tell me? She kept her voice even. In the great hall. Why condemn me and then… this? She gestured at him, at the space between them, at the whole strange situation of an alpha king crouched at a dungeon floor pushing evidence summaries through bars. He looked away. It was the first time she'd seen him look away from anything. The evidence was conclusive, he said. In public, in front of the council. I had a treaty falling apart and a court full of northern delegates and 3 people who would have had me destabilized before winter if I'd shown a moment's uncertainty. He paused. I made a decision. You made the wrong decision. I know. She hadn't expected that. It landed differently than she'd planned for. Then what is this? She said, quieter now. He looked back at her. The glass was gone. Not replaced by anything soft, replaced by something rawer than that. Something stripped of the ceremony she'd always seen him wearing. This, he said, is me trying to fix it. She held his gaze until her chest ached with the effort of holding everything still, and then she stepped back from the bars and sat down on the pallet and picked up the evidence summary again. Her hands were steadier than her heart. Calloway's ink records, she said, and Pell's betting debts. Someone paid those debts within the last month. Find who, and you'll find your forger. A long pause. Yes, he said. And then, something else she hadn't expected. Something raw around the edges. I'm sorry you're cold. She didn't look up from the paper. Then get me out of here. Not yet. The words cost him something. She could hear it. If I release you without evidence, the council challenges the ruling. There are people watching this case who are watching more than just you. If I move too fast, you'll look uncertain. People die when I look uncertain. His voice was entirely steady. I need you to understand that. She pressed her lips together. Outside her window slit, the 2 stars she'd named Anchor and Hold were their usual cold punctuation in the dark. I understand it, she said. I don't forgive it. I'm not asking you to. He left. But the footsteps were slower this time, like a man carrying more than he'd arrived with. On the 8th night, she heard him arguing with someone in the corridor. She had been almost asleep, which had taken her a long time to get to. The pallet was not comfortable, and the cold had a particular quality around the 3rd hour of morning that settled into the joints like slow water into cracked stone. She had finally found the position that worked, one arm over her eyes, the blanket Oswin had given her pulled to her chin, and she was drifting in the particular gray water state between waking and not, when the voices came. One was his. Low, controlled, but stripped of ceremony in the way it only was when the court wasn't watching. The other was younger, sharper, with the particular crisp consonants of someone from the Western Territories. She lay very still and listened. Not appropriate for you to be down here, Your Majesty. The council has noted. The council, Caius said, and the way he said it had the weight of something he was deciding how far to move. Can note whatever it likes. Caius. First name. Someone who had the right to it. You've been here every night for a week. People are talking. People are always talking. This is different. They're saying… I don't care what they're saying. The cold finality of it. Go back upstairs, Tavin. A silence. The young man, Tavin, she filed it, was doing his own version of the internal struggle Seren had become familiar with, the one that happened when you pushed back against this particular person and found a wall. The northern delegates arrive in 4 days, Tavin said. Final attempt. The council expects you present for the full reception. They need to see stability. They need to see… 4 days, Caius said. Tavan, go. The footsteps retreated. One set, going up, with the particular frustrated rhythm of someone who had lost an argument they were certain they were right about. Then, in the corridor outside her cell, quiet. She opened her eyes. The torchlight was at its lowest ebb, barely more than ember glow. She sat up slowly and looked toward the bars. He was there. He had his shoulder to the corridor wall, and his arms crossed and his eyes already on her cell. She realized, with a start that moved through her like cold water, that he'd known she was awake. He'd been able to tell. "Your bond sense," she said, and her voice came out rough from near sleep. Something in his posture shifted. "Yes. You knew I was listening. I knew you were awake." A pause. "I'm sorry. I didn't intend—" "Who is Taven?" He was quiet for a moment. "My youngest brother." She absorbed this. A king with a brother young enough to have that voice. A brother who used his first name, who came to argue with him in dungeon corridors at 3 a.m. A brother who knew about the visits and was worried enough to come personally. "He's right," she said. His eyes found hers immediately. "About the stability argument," she said. "Not about you stopping, but he's not wrong that it looks—" She paused, chose her words with the precision she'd have used on a disputed document. "It looks like you have a particular investment in the outcome of my case." "I do." "The council doesn't know why." "No." She pulled the blanket tighter. "What happens when they figure it out?" A long silence, the river breathing, the ember glow of the torches. "I'll handle it," he said. "That's not an answer." He looked at her. The Goldwater thing, very visible, and beneath it something harder. The immovable rock of a decision already made. "It's the only answer I have right now. I'm handling a great many things simultaneously, Seren. And I'm doing it in the order that keeps you safest. And I know that doesn't satisfy you. And I know you don't need it to satisfy you because you're capable of holding more uncertainty than most people I know. I've watched you do it. But it's what I have." She held his gaze. "Your brother," she said. "Does he know? About the bond?" The pause was different this time. Longer. "No," Caius said finally. "Nobody knows. Not even you 3 weeks ago." He was quiet. Then, "I knew something. I've known something for 2 years." He turned his face away slightly, not looking away from her but tilting, the way you tilt toward a sound you're not sure you heard. "I'm not going to claim I handled it with any particular intelligence." "You didn't," she agreed. His mouth did the almost smile again. She was beginning to catalog them. She had 3 now, each distinct. This one was rueful. The second one, from the celestial navigation argument, was surprised into existence. The third she'd only seen once, for half a second in the archive, and she wasn't sure she'd been meant to see it at all. That one looked like joy. "Good night, Caius," she said. "Good night." She lay back down. She didn't close her eyes for a while. She lay there listening to him in the corridor, the specific quality of his present silence, and she thought about a man who had known something for 2 years and had navigated it badly, and a woman who had known the same thing and filed it under strange and kept walking. They had both been very stupid, she thought, in very similar ways. On the 9th night, he brought her a book. It was a small thing, one of the volumes from the restricted archive collection, the kind she would never have had clearance to request. A natural history of wolf-shifter bond magic, dense with margin notes in an older hand. He pushed it through the gap in the bars without comment. She caught it before it touched the floor. She looked at the spine, then at him. "This is from the king's private collection," she said. "Yes. These margin notes are old enough to be my great-grandfather's." A pause. He was also fond of the archive. She opened to the first page. The handwriting was indeed old, not the careful formal script of official documents, but something more urgent. A man thinking on paper, the letters pressing hard. She looked up. Caius. She used his name. She wasn't sure why. It came out before she decided on it. His whole body stilled. Completely. In a single breath. The way a wolf goes still when it hears something it's been waiting for. His eyes found hers in the torchlight, and the color of them was something she hadn't had enough light to see properly before. Not gray-green at all, she realized. Gray-green was the armor. Underneath, in low firelight, they were the dark gold of river water over stones. "Don't," he said very softly. "Unless you mean it." She did mean it. She didn't know what she meant by meaning it. She looked back at the book and said nothing, and he stood at the bars for a long time before he left. Her wolf, for the first time in 9 days, came forward in her chest, not retreating, leaning. She pressed her hand flat against her sternum and told it no, not yet. The days had a rhythm now, and rhythm was survival. Morning, the evidence summary, which had grown to 3 pages of her own notes in the margins. Afternoon, the book from his great-grandfather's collection, which she read slowly because she was reading for 2 things at once, the information and the margin notes, the living man's voice under the old dead one. Evening. Conversation with Oswin, who had begun to let his guard down in small ways, who touched the back of his neck less and offered more, who was, she suspected, reporting not just to the official log but to someone else. Night. Caius. Not every night. On the 11th night he didn't come, and she lay awake long past the midnight bell and told herself she was cataloging the ceiling stones, which she wasn't. On the 12th night he came twice, once at midnight and once near dawn, and the second time she was already awake, sitting up, and he said, "Why are you awake?" And she said, "Why are you here at dawn?" And he said, "I couldn't sleep," which was the most unguarded thing he'd said yet, and she filed it carefully and said nothing. The book from his collection had a chapter on the bond sense, the way a fated mate's scent came to you before you understood what it was, the way it arrived as familiarity before it arrived as recognition. She read this 3 times. She read it a 4th. She thought about all the times she had been in the same room as Caius Vale, not just the midwinter presentation 2 years ago. There had been other moments, smaller ones, the unremarkable accumulations of 2 people who existed in the same palace without knowing each other. She had been in the great hall for at least a dozen formal occasions. She had twice been called to verify documents in the council anteroom while he was present at the table. She had passed through the main courtyard while he trained with the palace guard, and she had not looked twice because she was carrying an armful of survey maps, and she was late, and she didn't look twice at anything she wasn't paid to look twice at. Each time she would have been close enough to smell him. She hadn't thought anything of it because she didn't know to think anything of it. She was from the Ashford Pack, a mid-sized territory pack 3 days' ride from the capital, and bond sense was something that happened to important people in formal ceremonies with witnesses and symbolic declarations. Not to junior archivists who walked along rivers alone and filed things under strange. She set the book down. The chapter said, "The bond scent arrives not as novelty but as familiarity. It is the scent of something you cannot identify because you have never smelled it before, and yet you know it absolutely, the way you know your own hand in the dark. This is why the first encounter is so often missed. The body says, 'I know this.' The mind, which has never known anything like it, hears that as, 'I must have known this,' and it moves on." She had moved on, twice a year at least for 2 years. She thought, You fool. You absolute, thorough fool. Her wolf was not even marginally sympathetic. It pressed against her sternum and radiated something that was entirely, I told you so. Outside the window slit, the sky was doing its very early thing. Not dawn yet, but the absence of true black. The first suggestion of possible blue. Anchor and hold were still there. She had known his scent 2 years ago, and she hadn't thought anything of it. She thought about it now for a very long time, and her wolf leaned and leaned in her chest, and she did not push it back. Oswin came to her on the 14th day with a face like a man carrying something too large. He stood outside the bars with her bowl of stew, and he set it down carefully, and he said, voice low, Lady Councillor Marin visited Calloway's shop 3 months ago, bought 2 pots of archive ink. Seren set down the evidence summary. Marin. I didn't say it. Councillor Marin. 20 years on the King's Council, and her older brother had led the Northern Peace Delegation, and the treaty Seren was accused of sabotaging would have made her family's eastern trade routes significantly less profitable. Seren had transcribed 3 separate documents in Marin's voice over 2 years. She knew her handwriting like she knew the shape of an argument. Careful at the beginning, increasingly careless in the middle when she felt secure, and then corrected at the end. The forgery, Serene said. In the middle section, the handwriting tightens and then smooths out again. Oswin touched his neck. That's hers, Serene said. Marin got overconfident in the middle and then fixed it. She used my materials. She used my seal. But she wrote it herself. That's... Oswin stopped, looked at her with something complicated. That's the kind of thing that needs to go to... I know. She leaned forward, both hands on the cold bars. Tonight. Tell him tonight. Oswin picked up the bowl again and then set it back and said, very quietly, He already knows. She went still. He has known for 3 days, Lady Seren. The Calloway's records came in, and they matched to other purchases tied to Marin's household, and... He stopped again. His fingers were hard on the back of his neck. I shouldn't... He's known for 3 days, she said. The words came out flat. Even. He's building a case, Oswin said, quickly, carefully. You can't just... With a council member, you have to have the kind of evidence that can't be challenged in a public... He's known for 3 days, Serene said again. And I've been in this cell for 3 days past when I needed to be. She stepped back from the bars. She picked up her stew bowl, and she ate because she needed to eat. And she did not say another word to Oswin that evening. And when he left, she sat in the center of the pallet and breathed through her nose, and felt something in her chest go from warm to cold. He had known. He had been coming to her cell with that expression. That stripped, raw, the glass is gone expression. And he had known she could be out, and he had kept her here anyway. For the case, for the appearance of the case, for the presentation of it. She understood why. She understood strategy. She had spent 2 years in the archives, and she understood better than most people how kings made decisions, how the appearance of authority had to be managed like a separate living thing, how one misstep could avalanche. Understanding it and forgiving it were different things. She was very cold that night. She had been cold for 2 weeks in the dungeon, and she had managed it. She had the blanket and the pallet and the rhythm of Oswin's visits, and the evidence summary to work through, and she had found, in all of that, a kind of equilibrium, not comfort, not peace, but a working arrangement with her circumstances that let her function and think and stay useful. The news that he had known, that he had come to these bars with the information sitting in his pocket, with the Calloway's records already tied to Marin's household, with the end of her imprisonment within reach, broke through that equilibrium like a foot through ice. She wasn't angry exactly. She had spent enough time in the palace archive, transcribing the records of every high-stakes decision the Vale Kings had made over 2 centuries, to understand the machinery of it. You didn't move against a sitting council member without a case so complete it couldn't be challenged. You didn't show your hand until the hand was unbeatable. She knew this. She had, in fact, helped him build the hand, but knowing the logic of a thing did not make the inside of it less cold. She thought about his face at the bars, the stripped expression, the glass gone. She thought about the book from his great-grandfather's collection, the margin notes, the dried figs, the thank you she'd written that he'd collected and presumably kept. All of that was real. She didn't think she'd been wrong to read it as real, but he had been doing 2 things at once, building the case and coming to the bars. And he had kept those 2 things separate in a way that felt, in the low hours of the night, like its own kind of small dishonesty. Not a lie. Something quieter. The omission of the thing that would have changed the temperature of everything else. She stayed on the pallet for a long time with her back straight and her hands in her lap, and she thought about who she was and who he was, and what it meant that neither of them had said anything for 2 weeks that was the most important thing. When he came at midnight, she didn't move. She stayed on the pallet, knees drawn up, spine straight, face toward the wall. He stopped outside her cell. She could smell him, all of him, the pine and the slate and that warmer undertone. And beneath it tonight something sharp. Something that smelled like a man who'd spent the afternoon doing something that cost him. Like tension lived in. You know, he said. 3 days, she said to the wall. A long silence. Yes. Quiet. No defense in it. You kept me here 3 extra days. To protect the case, to protect you. If Marin's allies move before the evidence is airtight. You kept me here. She turned to look at him then, and she let him see it. All of it. The cold, the anger, the particular hurt of someone who had started, carefully and despite everything, to trust. 3 days ago you could have at least told me. You came here. You stood at those bars. You gave me a book. Her voice cracked on the last word and she hated it and let it happen. You didn't say a word. His jaw worked. His hands at his sides were very still. No, he said. I didn't. Why not? He looked at her. The gold in his eyes was very clear in the torchlight. Because I couldn't explain it without asking you for something you hadn't offered me, and I had no right to ask. She didn't understand that. She stared at him. Serene. He came closer to the bars. Close enough that if she reached through, she could have touched the dark fabric at his chest. She didn't. I've been coming here every night for 2 weeks, and I cannot tell you it was only about the case. I can't stand in front of you and call it strategy. He stopped, breathed. I am trying to do the right thing by you, and I keep being in this corridor, and I should have told you. That was wrong. I will not insult you by explaining it away. She looked at him for a long time. Her wolf was perfectly still inside her, the held breath kind of still. Get me out of here, Caius, she said. Get me out of here and do what you need to do, and when it's done, we'll talk about whether I still have anything left to say to you. His eyes closed, just briefly. Tomorrow, he said. I'll have enough tomorrow. Then come back tomorrow. He opened his eyes. He looked at her like she was the 2 stars through the window slit, like she was something he'd been looking at from very far away and hadn't been sure would still be there when he checked again. Good night, Seren. Good night. He did not come alone the following night. He came with Oswin and with 2 other guards and with the palace head archivist, a small, severe woman named Draven, who had a habit of pulling at her left ear when presented with anything unexpected, and who was pulling at it continuously as they walked down the corridor. He came with a formal order of release, and with a second document that Seren wouldn't understand fully until later. She heard them coming from 2 corridors away, the sound of purpose, of multiple sets of feet moving in coordination, of someone's breath coming quick with barely contained excitement. Oswin, probably. Then the heavier step, the one she knew now like a particular key, like the sound a specific door made. She was standing at the bars when they rounded the corner. He stopped when he saw her. The small party stopped behind him, all of them reading the room the way people did around a king, watching which way he moved before they moved. He held out the release order through the bars. She took it, read it once, quickly, and her hands were perfectly steady. "The evidence against Councillor Marin has been presented to the full council," he said. His voice was formal, because the archivist and the guards were listening. "Your name is cleared. The Ashford Pack has been formally notified." She folded the release order. "And the forged treaty?" "Void. The northern delegates have been briefed. New negotiations begin in the spring." She nodded. One of the guards was already working the lock on her cell. The door swung outward, and she felt the difference between the air of the cell and the air of the corridor immediately. More movement, slightly warmer, the torches closer. 2 weeks of stone cold compressed into the back of her lungs like something she'd breathe out slowly. She stepped out. He was 6 feet away. The guards and the archivist were behind him, and Oswin was doing his best impression of a man who wasn't watching everything very carefully. "Seren of the Ashford Pack," Caius said, still formal, still with the watching eyes around him. "The Crown owes you redress." He held out the second document. She took it, read it, looked up slowly. It was an appointment. Junior archivist elevated to senior archivist of the first collection. The King's private archive. The restricted stacks. The room with the old volumes and the older margin notes. The whole living record of 200 years of Vale rulers. She was being given the keys to his family's memory. "This isn't redress," she said, quiet enough that it was only for him. "This is trust." His jaw tightened. "Yes," he said. The archivist was pulling her ear. Oswin had stopped pretending not to watch. Seren folded the appointment into her sleeve. She looked at Caius Vile, the broken nose and the gold river eyes, and the still hands and all of the contained power-held fist of him, and underneath it the man who had crouched outside her cell at dawn because he couldn't sleep, who had given her his great-grandfather's private marginalia, who had known a debt before he knew what to do about it. "Let's go upstairs," she said. They moved Marin to house arrest within the week. The trial was swift by royal standards, the kind of swift that happens when a king decides he is done being patient, and Caius had apparently run out of patience sometime around the 14th day of dungeon visits, though he did not say this to anyone officially. The Northern Treaty negotiations were rescheduled, and Seren, who had been the transcriptionist for the original documents and knew the trade language that most of the palace staff did not, was assigned to the new delegation as senior records keeper. She did not see him during those days. The palace was in the particular controlled chaos of political repair, people being reshuffled, allegiances recalculated, the council moving with the careful energy of a group that has just watched one of their own fall and is very interested in demonstrating their own loyalty. She had work to do, and she did it, and she spent her evenings in the first collection archive getting to know the stacks. His great-grandfather's hand was in everything. A king who had loved the physical world of documents the way she did, who had left opinions in margins, arguments with long-dead scholars, small, delighted notes about rare finds. She started to understand, spending evenings in those stacks, how a man who came from this careful love of knowing, this margin note tradition of private feeling, could have grown into a man who expressed himself in books pushed through cell bars. She was there on a Thursday evening, cross-legged on the floor with 3 volumes around her and a lamp at her elbow, when she heard his step in the hallway outside. She looked up. He appeared in the archive doorway, and he stopped. She was in the middle of his family's memory, in a pool of lamplight, with an old King's margin notes in her hand. His expression did something she recognized now. The thing under glass, and then the glass going. "You found the botanical collection," he said. She looked down at the volume in her lap, a natural history, 3rd edition, with notes in the same impatient hand. "He was right about the willow root compounds," she said. "The standard treatment was wrong for a generation because nobody read the margins." Caius crossed the room and sat down on the floor, 3 feet from her, with the matter-of-fact movement of a man who had done this before in some other life. He reached past her for one of the other volumes, the one on star charts, which she hadn't opened yet, and turned to a page near the back. "He was wrong about Arden's crossing," he said. "Look at this calculation." She leaned over. Their shoulders were nearly touching. She could smell him without even trying. Pine, slate, and that warm underneath. And something new now. Something that her wolf identified immediately and that she was not going to name yet. Not tonight. She concentrated on the calculation. He made an arithmetic error in the 4th step. Every royal astronomer for 60 years repeated it. Nobody checked his work. He was the king. She looked up. They were very close. The lamplight made the gold in his eyes extraordinary. "That's an argument for checking King's work," she said. His mouth did something that, in a less controlled man, would have been a smile. "I'm aware." They sat there on the floor of his great-grandfather's archive for 2 hours, working through an argument about celestial navigation that was entirely genuine and entirely not about celestial navigation. And when the lamp burned low, she stood and began reshelving the volumes, and he stood and helped her, and their hands were on the same spine twice, and neither of them said anything about it. At the door, she stopped. "I'm not ready," she said, without turning around. "I want you to know I know what I felt in the dungeon. I know what the scent was. I've been in these stacks and I've read the chapter on bond scents, and I am not a fool." She paused. "I am also not going to pretend none of the rest of it happened." "I know," he said, behind her. Close enough that his voice came warm at the back of her neck. "You kept me there 3 extra days. Yes. You sentenced me without letting me speak past 2 lines. Yes. And you came to those bars every night before I even knew who had started coming." A silence. Then, "Yes." She turned around. He was close, and his expression was all gold river water and no glass at all, and she was aware of her wolf at the center of her chest pressing forward with an insistence that had graduated past leaning into something more like certainty. "I need time," she said. "I know. And I need you to not push." "I won't." She held his gaze. He held it back. He didn't reach for her, didn't move, didn't use any of the considerable gravity of him. He just looked at her, steadily, the way he had in the great hall before the sentencing, except that now she understood what was in it. Not watching something go out. Watching, instead, to see if it would stay lit. She went to her rooms. She did not sleep for a very long time. The jealousy came from a direction she hadn't predicted. There was a northern delegate named Aldrich, tall, easy with a laugh, the kind of man whose charm was such a natural extension of his personality that it barely registered as effort. He had an interest in the archive records that was entirely professional, and he had very quickly noticed that Seren was both competent and, as he put it, refreshingly uninterested in court positioning. He started coming to the archive in the afternoons. He brought her tea, which he prepared himself because he found the palace tea too bitter, a detail she found endearing without finding him compelling. He made her laugh twice. The third afternoon, Caius came to the archive. She heard him before she saw him, the particular density of his approach, the way the hallway sounds changed around him, and she looked up from the document she was translating to find him in the doorway, and she saw him see Aldrich. She watched it happen. She watched the Alpha King's face do something she had not yet seen it do. The controlled, power-held fist of him clenching, invisibly, in the space behind his eyes, and his jaw going absolutely still the way a jaw goes still when the mouth is working to close over something that wants out. His gaze went from Aldrich to her and back, and she could see him. Actually see him, choosing not to react, and the choosing was a visible effort, which meant the thing he was choosing not to do was real. The scent of him hit her then, sharp over the pine and slate, something she'd read about in the margin notes, possessive, bright, and tightly leashed. Aldrich hadn't noticed. He was telling her about a survey method used in the Northern Territories, and he was completely unaware of the silent struggle happening in the doorway 3 feet behind him. "Your Majesty," Seren said, looking directly at Caius. Aldrich turned, immediately deferential. "Your Majesty, I was consulting with Archivist Serene on the survey records." "Aldrich." Caius's voice was entirely level. "I need a word with my archivist." "My archivist, not the archivist." She watched Aldrich go, watched him pass Caius in the doorway with a polite nod, watched Caius not move a single inch to make it more comfortable. And then Caius stepped into the archive and she crossed her arms and looked at him and said nothing. He looked back. "Don't," she said. His jaw worked. "I am your archivist," she said. "I am a senior member of your palace staff. If I have collegial conversations with the delegates I am assigned to work with, that is—" "I know." The words came out with difficulty. "I know that." "Then why are you here?" A long silence. The archive smelled of old paper and lamp oil. And him. The sharp, bright thing fading a little as he held still. The pine and slate steadying. "Because I came to bring you this," he said, and produced a small folded note from his pocket. He held it out. She took it. Read it. It was the official Calloway's ink record. The original. With his signature at the bottom confirming it as court evidence, and below his signature a notation in his own handwriting. For the archive. First collection case file. Seren of Ashford. He had put her case in the permanent record, in the first collection, in his family's memory alongside 300 years of history. She looked up. His expression was doing the Goldwater thing. No glass anywhere. "That's not why you came," she said. "No." Very quiet. She set the document carefully on the archive table. She thought about the Great Hall, and the chains, and the 3 extra days, and the book pushed through the bars. She thought about a man who could not sleep at dawn, and who sat on archive floors, and who was standing here now with his jaw working, and his scent doing things he couldn't control. She crossed the 3 feet between them and put her hand flat on the center of his chest, over his heart. He went perfectly still. She could feel his heartbeat under her palm, faster than the authority of him would suggest, much faster. "I need more time," she said. "Seren, I need more time," she said again. "But I want you to know that I'm taking it." She looked up at him. "I'm not walking away. I'm taking time. Do you understand the difference?" He looked down at her. His hand came up, slowly, very slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back, and covered hers where it rested over his heart. "Yes," he said. She stepped back. He let her go. She picked up the Calloway's document and went back to her work, and he watched her for a moment. And then he left. And the scent of him in the archive afterward was pine and slate and something warmer. Something that had been there since the first time she'd stood close enough to know it. Something she was ready now to call what it was. The council meeting happened on a Tuesday. Seren wasn't in it. She was in the archive, as she often was at the third hour of morning, when the palace was quiet enough that the oldest documents didn't feel like they were competing with anything. She had a translation she was working on, a treaty from the previous century that had a disputed clause. The kind of thing that kept diplomats arguing for generations because nobody had gone back to read what the word had meant in the original language. She was 60 years closer to solving it than anyone had been in decades, and she was absorbed in it in the particular way that made her forget to eat. She didn't know what was happening 2 floors above her until Oswin appeared in the archive doorway, flushed, with his hand already on the back of his neck. She looked up. Lady Marin's allies on the council, he said, breathless. They've moved formally to have the king's discretionary powers reviewed, on the grounds that recent decisions have been— He consulted a small piece of paper. Compromised by personal entanglement with a low-ranking outsider. Seren set down her pen. They named you specifically, Oswin said. The daily archive visits, the appointment to first collection, the case file notation. He paused. They're calling it an inappropriate attachment formed under circumstances of— They're saying the dungeon visits indicate— He stopped, looked at her with great discomfort. They're using it to undermine him. She understood this immediately. The architecture of it, the way Marin's faction had read the situation and found the lever. They couldn't touch the evidence that had cleared Seren. Caius had built it too solidly. So they were going after the thing that looked like weakness. The thing he couldn't easily defend without either denying something true or admitting something he hadn't formally declared. They were going to use the fact that he cared about her to break him. She picked up her pen, replaced it, and stood. "What's he doing?" she asked. Oswin's hand pressed hard against his neck. "Right now? The council is presenting the motion and he's—" A pained pause. "He's not stopping them." "What do you mean he's not stopping them?" "He's letting them speak. He's sitting there, and he's— Lady Seren, he's going to concede it. I think he's going to concede the motion. I think he's going to remove himself from decisions related to you and create a formal distance, and I think—" Oswin stopped, looked at her with the direct, unable to pretend quality of a man who had written King present. Cell 7 corridor in an official log every night for 2 weeks. I think he's going to let them win because he thinks that's how he protects you. She was already moving. The council chamber was on the 2nd floor, and the guards at the door stepped aside for her before she'd had a chance to say a word. She did not know if this was because of her senior archivist appointment or because of the look on her face, and it did not matter. She walked in. It was the full council, all 14 of them, and they were mid-presentation, and Caius was at the head of the table in his formal chair, and his face was the still water expression she hadn't seen since the Great Hall. All glass, all armor. A king doing what kings did when they needed to hold a room together while something inside them went cold. The counselor who was speaking, a broad man named Lorth, who she now recognized as connected to Marin's family, stopped when she entered. The room turned. Caius looked at her. His expression did not change. She walked to the head of the table. "Archivist Seren," Lorth said, recovering. "This is a closed council session." "Then close it properly," she said. "Or explain to me the section of the court charter that prohibits the named subject of an active motion from speaking in her own capacity." She had, in fact, read the entire court charter last week. Being in an archive for 2 weeks had given her thorough reading time. Lorth opened his mouth. She didn't wait. "You're using the king's behavior during my imprisonment to challenge his judgment," she said, addressing the council directly, not Caius. "You're suggesting that his visits to my cell indicate a compromised state. I'd like to address what those visits were." She could feel Caius behind her, the force of his stillness. "They were investigation," she said. "Every visit. He brought me evidence. He collected my analysis. And he used that analysis to build the case against Counselor Marin. You have the case files. You can read the timeline. Every piece of evidence I contributed came through those bars and went directly into the investigative record." She held Lorth's gaze. "If you'd like to argue that the king's methods were unorthodox, you're welcome to make that case. But the results are in front of you. A corrupt council member removed, a treaty preserved, an innocent person exonerated." She paused. "You'd like to call that compromise judgment. I'd call it the definition of the job." The chamber was very quiet. She turned to Caius. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face. Something beyond the gold water. Something that had no armor on it at all. Something she might have called undone. "Your Majesty," she said, "I'd suggest the motion be tabled." The silence lasted 3 more seconds. "Motion tabled," Caius said. His voice was exactly level. "We're adjourned." The council moved with the careful efficiency of people who have just watched a wall fall and want to be on the other side of the rubble. Lorth looked at Seren with an expression that was not quite respect and not quite fury, something compound and unsettled. And then he filed out with the rest. And then the room was empty, except for the 2 of them. She didn't turn around immediately. She looked at the council table, the formal arrangement of it, the weight of the institution, the centuries of decisions made here, good and terrible, and everything between. And she breathed. She felt him come up behind her. He stopped close enough that she could feel the warmth of him at her back, and she turned. His face was the stripped thing, all the glass gone, for the 3rd time. But this time something was different. The previous times had been private, had been the dungeon or the archive, had been night or lamplight or the intimacy of bars between them. This was the council chamber in full daylight, and he was looking at her like she was the only fixed point in a room that was rotating. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "You were going to let them use me against you. You could have stayed out of it. You've already paid." "I didn't do it for you," she said, and then stopped and reconsidered because that wasn't entirely true. "I did it for me, too. I'm not going to be a weapon against a man who was right, and I'm not going to stand in an archive while someone uses my name to—" She stopped again. The thing in her chest was very loud. "And I did it for you," she said. "Obviously I did it for you. Don't make me pretend otherwise." He reached up and put his hand alongside her jaw, slowly, the way he'd covered her hand in the archive. All the time in the world, all the choice in the world. And she turned into it before she'd decided to. Her cheek against his palm, his thumb at her temple, the warmth of him like coming in from the cold, like putting your hands against a fire that had been burning all this time just on the other side of a wall. "I am going to spend a long time making this right," he said. "You already started," she said. "Keep going." He exhaled. She felt it against her hair. "The bond," he said very quietly. "I knew. Before the sentencing. I knew when you walked into the Great Hall, the scent of you, Seren, I need you to know that it is part of why I couldn't—" He stopped, steadied. "I handled it badly. I had a room full of people watching for weakness and a treaty hanging by a thread, and I knew, the moment you stood in those chains, what you were to me, and I made the wrong choice. I put the crown over the truth." She listened to his heartbeat, steady now, under her cheek. the same rhythm she'd felt through the bars. "You came back," she said, "every night." "Then that's where we start," she said. "Not in the Great Hall, not the sentencing. We start from the night you first came." His arms came around her, both of them, settling with a quiet certainty that felt less like a decision and more like something falling into place that had always been in motion. She let herself be held, let the warmth of him be real and specific and present, and her wolf went quiet with the particular quiet of something that has finally found the thing it was straining toward. Outside the council chamber's high windows, the city of Vielle-Dune went about its afternoon. The river was somewhere beyond the walls, doing its low breathing. The sky was a pale winter white, the kind that holds all its light flat and diffused, and in it nothing was hidden. The weeks that followed were not simple. They were not simple because nothing real ever was, and because the bond that was building between them was the kind that had weight, the kind that pushed against everything around it, that required both of them to hold steady while the court and the council and the remnants of Marin's faction reconfigured themselves around a new reality. The northern delegation wrapped their work and left with a signed treaty and a standing invitation to return. Oswin was quietly promoted to head of palace security, which was an open secret that everyone pretended not to know was Caius's doing. The Ashford pack sent a formal letter of acknowledgement, stiff and official, that Seren read once and filed without ceremony. Caius found her in the archive the morning she filed it. He leaned in the doorway and watched her for a moment and then said, "Was it enough?" She understood the question. The Ashford pack was her history. 3 generations of being average, of being overlooked, of being the girl who moved through rooms without leaving a mark on the air. The letter was the closest thing to an apology she would likely ever receive from the people who had raised her and never quite seen her. "No," she said, honestly. "But I don't need it to be." He was quiet. "I've been thinking about what I told you in the archive," she said, "about needing more time." She closed the filing cabinet drawer. "I think I was protecting myself from something I'd already decided." He was very still in the doorway. She crossed the archive to him. She stopped with a foot of space between them, and looked up and let him see her face without any management of it. The warmth and the wariness and the particular feeling of someone who has been hurt by the person in front of her and has chosen with full information to keep going. "I know what you did," she said. "The sentencing, the 3 days. I know what it cost you to come to those bars, and I know what it cost you not to say things sooner. I know what you were managing, and I know what you got wrong." She held his gaze. "I'm not pretending any of it didn't happen." "I know," he said. "And I'm choosing you anyway, not despite it. Because of it, a little. Because I know how you move when things go badly, and I know what you do when you've made a mistake, and I know you come back." She reached up and put her hand at his jaw the way he'd done to her. She felt him lean into it, the smallest fraction, the involuntary lean of something that has been very careful for a very long time. "I'm choosing you because you came back to those bars every night before you had any reason to think I'd let you." He turned his face into her palm. "Seren." Her name in his voice was the same as it had been the 5th night, when he'd said it in the torchlight with everything stripped bare, except that now the echo of it filled the archive and bounced off 300 years of margin notes and landed warm. "I know," she said. "Me too." He kissed her the way the margin notes had said the bond worked. Not as introduction, but as recognition, as 2 people finding, in the specific warmth of it, a thing they had both been circling since the first time they'd breathed the same air, before either of them understood what that meant. The archive smelled of old paper and lamp oil and pine and warmth and something new, something that had been building since a dungeon and a finger width of sky and 2 stars named Anchor and Hold. She had named them for herself, she realized. She had named them because they were the two fixed things she could see from inside a stone wall. And the thing about fixed points was that you didn't have to reach them. You just had to be able to see them. They pulled you straight, even from a distance. They reminded you which way was home. He was still holding her when the morning light came full through the archive windows, and she thought, there it is. There is the answer to every unfair thing that led here. Not justice, exactly. Not a Rashir. Just this. Just the warmth of a man who made the wrong choice, and then came back every night until he could make a better one, and a woman who saw him coming and did not look away. The rest was margin notes. The rest was the kind of story you wrote in the space where the official record ran out. The part that mattered most. That nobody logged in an official document. That lived only in the lean of a wolf toward what it had always known. In the sound of two heartbeats finally in the same room. Finally at rest. Finally unafraid to be exactly what they were.